I'm Margaret, 68 years old, living in sunny Florida where I thought I'd found my peaceful retirement haven. After dedicating my entire life to family, nothing prepared me for that Tuesday afternoon when my son Brandon looked me straight in the eyes and said those words that shattered my world. "You ruined our lives. Get out." Confused and heartbroken, I did something I never imagined I would do. I left without argument and cut them off completely. Little did I know walking away would be just the beginning of discovering who I really am. Before I tell you how my world fell apart that day in my son's kitchen, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories from someone who learned life's hardest lessons the hard way. My life in Florida hadn't always been marked by family drama. For 35 years, I taught second grade at Palmetto Elementary, pouring my heart into shaping young minds. Teaching wasn't just my career, it was my calling. The children's bright eyes and curious questions gave my days meaning and purpose. I retired only when Harold, my husband of 43 years, started showing signs that his health was declining. We had plans, travel, a small garden, afternoon walks on the beach. But life rarely follows our carefully laid plans. Harold passed away from a sudden heart attack 5 years ago. One minute we were discussing what to plant in our vegetable garden, and the next he was clutching his chest, eyes wide with fear. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it was already too late. Just like that, my partner, best friend, and the love of my life was gone. The grief was all-consuming at first, a physical ache that made it difficult to breathe. I wandered through our home touching his things, wearing his sweater despite the Florida heat, and speaking to him as if he might answer. Our son Brandon was my lifeline during those dark days. At 45, he had built a successful career as a financial advisor at a prestigious firm in Tampa. He would drive the 40 minutes to my house every weekend, sometimes bringing groceries, other times just sitting with me in silence. His wife Stephanie, 43, was a marketing executive for a luxury real estate company. They had the kind of marriage that looked perfect from the outside, matching careers, beautiful home, 2 wonderful children. My grandchildren were my world. Aiden, 15, had inherited his grandfather's talent for mathematics and quiet determination. Emma, 12, was artistic and sensitive, filling sketchbooks with drawings that showed remarkable talent for her age. Before everything fell apart, weekends at Grandma's house were a tradition. We'd bake cookies, play board games, or sometimes just sit on my patio watching the neighborhood cats prowl through the garden. Financially, I was comfortable but not wealthy. Harold had been prudent with our savings and left me with a modest pension and our fully paid condo. Brandon and Stephanie, however, lived a more lavish lifestyle than they could comfortably afford. When they mentioned struggling with the cost of Aiden and Emma's private school tuition 3 years ago, I offered to help. It seemed the natural thing to do. What else was I saving for if not for them? Soon I was paying not just for school but for summer camps, music lessons, and sports equipment. 2 years ago, when Stephanie's mother moved to Arizona for health reasons, they lost their primary childcare provider. Brandon suggested I might move closer to help with the kids after school. The condo next to theirs in the same complex happened to be for sale. Seemed like divine timing. I sold my home of 30 years and moved into the smaller space, telling myself it was an investment in my family's happiness. The first signs of tension appeared almost immediately after I moved. Small comments from Stephanie about my outdated parenting style stung, but I brushed them aside. When I suggested Aiden might benefit from less screen time, Stephanie smiled tightly and said, "We're raising our children for the digital age, Margaret, not the Stone Age." The comment was delivered with a laugh, but the message was clear. My input wasn't welcome. Brandon began to change too. My once attentive son became increasingly distant. Our Sunday dinners became shorter, his phone always in hand, half listening to my stories. When I mentioned it, he blamed work stress or fatigue. Once I overheard him telling Stephanie, "Just humor her, she doesn't have anyone else." The words cut deep, but I pretended not to hear. Still, I tried to maintain harmony. I bought books on modern parenting, kept my suggestions to myself unless asked directly, and tried to make myself useful without being intrusive. I learned to text instead of call, to ask before stopping by despite living next door, and to bite my tongue when I disagreed with their decisions. My relationship with my grandchildren remained the bright spot in increasingly cloudy days. Looking back, I can see the warning signs were there all along. I just chose to ignore them, telling myself that family sometimes hits rough patches, and that things would improve with time and patience. I couldn't have been more wrong. The conflicts with Stephanie became more frequent and less disguised as the months passed. What started as subtle digs about my parenting views evolved into open criticism. One afternoon, while helping Emma with a science project, Stephanie walked in and immediately took over, saying, "Mom has her own way of doing things, sweetie, but let me show you the right way." The dismissal happened right in front of Emma, whose embarrassed glance in my direction broke my heart. Brandon increasingly took Stephanie's side, even in trivial matters. When I made Harold's famous chili for Sunday dinner, Stephanie complained it was too spicy. Brandon, who had grown up loving that chili, pushed his bowl away and said, "Maybe you should stick to Stephanie's recipes when you cook for us." The betrayal stung. It wasn't about the chili at all, but about choosing sides. The incident at Emma's school play marked a significant turning point. Emma had been cast as the lead in her school production of Alice in Wonderland, and I was bursting with pride. I arrived early to help with costumes, something I'd done countless times during my teaching years. Backstage, I noticed Emma's costume needed last-minute adjustments. I was fixing the hem when Stephanie appeared, face flushed with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, pulling me aside where the children couldn't hear. The hem was coming loose. You're always just doing something, Margaret. Did I ask you to fix her costume? Did the teachers ask for your help? No. You're overstepping. Again. After the play, while other grandparents were taking photos with the cast, Stephanie made sure I was positioned far from Emma in every family picture. That night, I cried myself to sleep for the first time since Harold's funeral. Aiden's regional tennis tournament came next. I'd attended every local match, cheering proudly from the sidelines. For the regional tournament, I baked his favorite cookies and arrived with a small cooler of homemade sports drinks. Brandon met me at the entrance. "Mom, we've got this covered. Why don't you watch from the upper stands? Stephanie's parents are down front with us." "But I always sit with you," I said, confusion evident in my voice. That was before the coach limited each player to 4 supporters in the family section. "We need the spots for people Aiden specifically requested." I hadn't even known there was a limit. The message was clear. I wasn't among the chosen few. I sat alone in the nearly empty upper stands, watching my grandson play while his other grandmother sat proudly beside Stephanie. Aiden looked up a few times, waving half-heartedly in my direction. I waved back, forcing a smile through my tears. My 68th birthday should have been a celebration. Instead, it became another opportunity for Stephanie to make cutting remarks. I'd hoped for a small family dinner, nothing elaborate. What I got was a reservation at an expensive restaurant I didn't particularly like, where Stephanie spent the evening discussing their upcoming vacation, one they hadn't invited me to join. "It'll be so nice to have family time, just the 4 of us," she said, smiling at Brandon. "Everyone needs a break sometimes, don't they, Margaret?" The implication hung in the air. Everyone needed a break from me. Later that week, I stopped by unexpectedly when I saw Brandon's car in the driveway during work hours. I worried he might be sick. As I approached their front door, I heard my name through the partially open window. "Margaret is driving me crazy," Stephanie was saying. "She's always there, always watching, always judging." "What do you want me to do?" Brandon sounded tired. "She's my mother. She's suffocating us, Brandon. The kids can't breathe without Grandma hovering. I can't make a decision without her questioning it. Even if she doesn't say it out loud, I can see it in her eyes." I backed away silently, heart hammering in my chest. That night, I tried to talk to Brandon about what I'd heard, but he dismissed my concerns. "Stephanie's just stressed about work," he said. "Don't take it personally." But it was impossible not to take it personally when every interaction became strained with unspoken resentment. I began to feel like an intruder in their lives rather than a beloved family member. Still, I stayed, for Aiden and Emma, who still seemed to enjoy my company when their parents weren't around. The week before everything exploded was filled with small conflicts. Stephanie complained when I brought over a homemade lasagna. "We're trying to cut carbs, Margaret." Brandon became irritated when I offered to help Aiden with his math homework. He needs to learn to solve problems himself, Mom. Even Emma, my sweet Emma, rolled her eyes when I suggested we bake cookies together. That's kid stuff, Grandma. I felt increasingly unwelcome, increasingly unnecessary. Yet I never imagined how completely I was about to be cast out from the family I loved more than anything in the world. The day everything fell apart was a Sunday, usually reserved for family dinner at Brandon and Stephanie's. I arrived at 4 p.m. as always, letting myself in with the key they'd given me when I moved nearby. The house was unusually quiet. Normally, Emma would be practicing piano while Aiden complained about weekend homework. Instead, I found Stephanie alone in the kitchen, aggressively chopping vegetables. "Where is everyone?" I asked, setting down the apple pie I'd baked that morning, Brandon's favorite since childhood. "Brandon took the kids to get ice cream," Stephanie replied without looking up. "They should be back soon." I noticed the dishwasher was full of clean dishes, so I began unloading it, trying to be helpful. As I put away the plates, I reorganized the cabinet slightly, the everyday dishes at the front, the special occasion china at the back. It was a small change, but one I thought made practical sense. "What are you doing?" Stephanie's voice cut through the silence. "Just putting away the dishes," I said, continuing my task. "And rearranging my cabinets?" Again. She set down her knife with a sharp clack against the cutting board. "You know, Margaret, this is exactly the problem. You can't help yourself, can you? You have to control everything." "I'm not controlling anything," I said defensively. "I'm just helping. Help I didn't ask for. Help nobody wants." Her voice rose steadily. "Do you realize we rearrange everything back after you leave? Every single time." I stood frozen, a stack of plates still in my hands. "I didn't know that." "Of course you didn't, because you never ask. You just decide you know better than everyone else." The front door opened and Brandon walked in with the children. He sensed the tension immediately. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between us. "Your mother is reorganizing my kitchen." Again. Stephanie's voice was tight with frustration. "Mom," Brandon sighed, "we've talked about this." We hadn't, actually. Not once had Brandon mentioned any issue with how I helped around their house. But before I could point this out, Stephanie continued. "It's not just the kitchen, Brandon. It's everything. The way she undermines our parenting, the way she spoils the kids, the way she's always here, always watching, always judging." I began, but Brandon cut me off. "Enough, Mom." His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "Stephanie's right. This has been building for a long time." Emma and Aiden stood awkwardly in the doorway, eyes wide, ice cream cones melting onto their hands unnoticed. "Kids, go to your rooms," Brandon instructed. They disappeared quickly, relieved to escape the tension. Once they were gone, something in Brandon seemed to snap. Years of unspoken resentment poured out in a torrent. "Do you know what it's like, Mom? To have you constantly looking over our shoulders? To feel like we can never measure up to your perfect parenting? To have the kids compare us to you every time we say no to something. I never meant." "It doesn't matter what you meant," he shouted, his face reddening. "It matters what you did. You've been undermining us since the day you moved here. You've created this dependency. The kids expect everything to be handed to them because Grandma always says yes. We can't discipline them properly because they know they can run to you." Stephanie nodded vigorously beside him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "And the money," Brandon continued. "Yes, we were grateful for your help with tuition at first. But now it feels like you hold it over our heads. Like we owe you something for it." "I never asked for anything in return," I whispered, tears forming. "You didn't have to ask." Brandon's voice echoed through the kitchen. "It's in every look, every sigh, every helpful suggestion. You've made us feel like failures who can't provide for our own children." The accusations kept coming, each one more hurtful than the last. As they spoke, I realized with horrible clarity that they genuinely believed what they were saying. In their eyes, I wasn't the loving mother and grandmother I thought I was. I was an intruder. A burden. Problem. The final blow came when Brandon, face contorted with anger I'd never seen before, pointed toward the door and said those unimaginable words. "You've ruined our lives. You're suffocating us. Get out." The kitchen fell silent. I stood there, dishes still clutched in my trembling hands. Stephanie looked almost as shocked as I felt, though she didn't contradict him. I carefully set the plates on the counter. Without a word, I removed my house key from my keyring and placed it beside them. Then I walked out of the kitchen, past the living room filled with photos of happier times, and upstairs to the guest room where I kept a few personal items for overnight stays. I could hear Brandon and Stephanie arguing in harsh whispers downstairs. I packed my toiletries, a change of clothes, and the book I'd been reading to Emma at bedtime. As I zipped the small overnight bag, there was a soft knock at the door. Emma stood there, tears streaming down her face. "Are you leaving, Grandma?" "Just for tonight, sweetheart." I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is it because of what Dad said? He didn't mean it. He's just angry." I pulled her into a hug, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, knowing it might be the last time. Sometimes adults say things they regret when they're upset. Everything will be okay. Another lie. In my heart, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I walked downstairs with as much dignity as I could muster. Brandon and Stephanie stood in strained silence by the front door. "I think it's best if I go," I said quietly. Brandon wouldn't meet my eyes. Stephanie gave a curt nod. "Goodbye," I said, waiting, hoping for some sign that they didn't mean it, that I could stay, that we could talk this through. None came. I walked to my car alone, got in, and drove away from the family I loved more than anything in the world, not knowing if I would ever be welcome in their lives again. The 15-minute drive back to my condo passed in a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I barely felt the pain. The sun was setting over Tampa Bay, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that I couldn't appreciate through my tears. Twice I had to pull over because I couldn't see the road clearly. When I finally arrived home, the silence of my empty condo hit me like a physical force. For 2 years, my life had revolved around Brandon's family. Their schedule had been my schedule. Their needs had been my priority. Now suddenly, I had nowhere to be, no one who needed me. I sat on my couch in the dark, still wearing my coat, too numb to move. The clock ticked loudly in the kitchen, marking the passage of time in a world that had suddenly lost its meaning. Around midnight, I finally moved to the bedroom, though I didn't bother changing clothes. I lay awake until dawn, replaying Brandon's words over and over. "You've ruined our lives. You're suffocating us. Get out." Had I truly been so blind? Had my love and desire to help actually been harmful? The questions circled endlessly, bringing fresh waves of pain with each rotation. Morning came with no clarity, only exhaustion. I checked my phone repeatedly, hoping to see Brandon's name on the screen. Surely after a night's reflection, he would call to apologize, to say he'd spoken in anger, to ask me to come back. The call never came. By afternoon, hurt began transforming into something else. A quiet, smoldering anger. I had given everything to my family. After Harold died, I'd rebuilt my life around Brandon and his children. I'd moved from my home of 30 years to be closer to them. I'd spent my retirement savings on their expenses. I'd rearranged my schedule to accommodate their needs. And this was my reward? To be cast out like an unwelcome stranger? As evening approached with still no word from Brandon or Stephanie, I made my first decision. I would not chase after them. I would not beg for forgiveness for crimes I hadn't committed. If they wanted me in their lives, they would have to make the first move. By the second day, when my phone remained silent, the anger hardened into resolve. If they could cut me off so easily, perhaps it was time I did the same. With hands that trembled only slightly, I called my cell phone provider and changed my number. The representative asked if I wanted to forward any calls from the old number. "No," I said firmly. "No forwarding." Next, I composed an email to Brandon. I didn't allow emotion to dictate the content. Instead, I wrote factually about my decision to step away from family obligations. I explained that I would no longer be providing financial support for the children's education or activities. I wished them well but stated clearly that I needed time and space to reevaluate our relationship. I didn't mention Stephanie at all. I ended by asking them not to contact me for the time being. Then I hit send before I could change my mind. The following morning, I contacted Gerald, my attorney who had handled Harold's estate. We met for coffee at a small cafe far from Brandon's neighborhood. You want to change your will? Gerald confirmed, eyebrows raised in surprise. Brandon has been your sole beneficiary since Harold passed. Yes, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I'd like to explore alternatives. We discussed options, charitable foundations, educational trusts that would benefit my grandchildren directly without going through their parents, donations to my former elementary school. By the time we finished our second cup of coffee, I had a plan that felt right. One that honored my values while acknowledging the painful reality of my family situation. That afternoon, I called the private school where Aiden and Emma attended and informed them I would no longer be covering the tuition payments. The administrative assistant sounded surprised. The term is already underway, Mrs. Wilson. This might create some difficulty for the children. Their parents are well aware of the situation, I said, refusing to elaborate further. Each step I took to disentangle myself from Brandon's family brought a mixture of pain and liberation. It hurt to think of Aiden and Emma suffering because of adult conflicts. But for the first time in years, I was making decisions based solely on what I needed, not on what others expected of me. As I sat on my balcony that evening, watching boats drift across the bay, I forced myself to consider my own role in what had happened. Had I been overbearing? Possibly. Had I sometimes overstepped boundaries? Probably. Had I occasionally used my financial support to influence decisions? If I was being completely honest with myself, yes. But did those mistakes justify the way I'd been treated? The absolute rejection? The cruel words? No. Nothing justified that. By the end of the week, I had settled into a strange, hollow routine. I woke early, made coffee, read the newspaper, and tried to remember who I had been before my identity became Brandon's mother and Aiden and Emma's grandmother. I found myself staring at old photographs from my teaching days, wondering what had happened to the confident, independent woman in those images. One particularly difficult evening, when memories of reading bedtime stories to Emma threatened to overwhelm me, I picked up my phone to call Brandon. My finger hovered over his name in my contacts. Then I remembered his face as he told me to get out. I put the phone down and instead called a therapist whose name I'd found earlier that day. It was time to start healing, with or without my family's participation. The first week alone was the hardest. I moved through my condo like a ghost, touching familiar objects that suddenly seemed to belong to someone else's life. The refrigerator magnets Emma had made in art class. The coffee mug that said "World's Best Grandma" that Aiden had given me for Christmas. Each item sparked fresh grief. Sleep became elusive. When I did manage to drift off, I'd wake suddenly, certain I'd heard Emma calling for me after a nightmare. The silence that greeted me instead was almost unbearable. I stopped eating regular meals, subsisting on toast and tea. My clothes began to hang loosely on my frame. On the 8th day after the confrontation, a knock at my door startled me from my daze. I opened it to find Gloria, my neighbor from 2 doors down, holding a casserole dish. "I haven't seen you at the mailbox all week," she said, her Brooklyn accent still strong despite decades in Florida. "Thought you might need some dinner that doesn't come from a box." I hadn't spoken more than casual greetings to Gloria in the 2 years I'd lived in the building. My time had been so consumed by Brandon's family that I'd never bothered to make friends with my neighbors. Now, faced with her unexpected kindness, I burst into tears. To her credit, Gloria didn't flee from my emotional display. She stepped inside, set the casserole on my counter, and put the kettle on for tea. Then she sat with me at my kitchen table while I poured out the entire story. She listened without interruption, occasionally passing me tissues from her purse. "Sounds to me like you needed a friend even before all this happened," she said when I finally fell silent. "Well, now you've got one." Gloria's friendship became my lifeline. She invited me to join her water aerobics class at the community center the following day. I went reluctantly, certain I'd be too distracted by grief to participate. Instead, the gentle movement in the cool water provided the first moments of peace I'd experienced since Brandon's outburst. At Gloria's insistence, I attended a book club meeting at the center later that week. The 6 women welcomed me warmly, never prying when I gave vague answers about my family. For 2 hours, I lost myself in a discussion of a mystery novel I'd read at Gloria's suggestion. The mental engagement felt like waking up after a long sleep. Gradually, I established a new routine. Mornings began with coffee on my balcony, watching the sunrise over Tampa Bay. Then water aerobics 3 times a week, followed by lunch with Gloria or another new friend. Afternoons were for reading or walking along the shore. Evenings remained the hardest, the time I'd usually been with my grandchildren, but even those became more bearable as the weeks passed. 1 month after the confrontation, I reached out to Sandra, my closest colleague from my teaching days. We met for lunch at a cafe near my old school. Seeing her familiar face across the table brought a rush of memories from my life before it had narrowed to focus solely on Brandon's family. "You know," Sandra said as we finished our salads, "the district is desperately short of substitute teachers. They'd hire you in a heartbeat, even just part-time." The idea took root immediately. Teaching had been my passion for decades. Perhaps returning to the classroom even occasionally might help rebuild my sense of purpose. 2 days later, I submitted my application to the district office. Within a week, I was approved as a substitute teacher. My first assignment came quickly. A second-grade class, the same age I'd taught for most of my career. Walking into that classroom, surrounded by curious young faces and the familiar scent of crayons and pencil shavings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: joy. "Are you our teacher now?" A small girl with braids asked as I wrote my name on the whiteboard. "Just for today," I answered with a smile. "But I'm very happy to be here." By the end of that day, I'd remembered an essential truth I'd somehow forgotten. My value as a person didn't depend solely on my role as a mother and grandmother. I had skills, knowledge, and love to offer the world in many different ways. Therapy sessions twice weekly helped me process the rejection and rebuild my self-worth. Dr. Levine, a compassionate woman in her 50s, challenged me to examine patterns in my relationship with Brandon that might have contributed to our estrangement. "It sounds like you've been walking on eggshells around your son and daughter-in-law for years," she observed during one session. "That's not a healthy dynamic for anyone, including your grandchildren." She helped me see how my fear of loneliness after Harold's death had led me to become overly invested in Brandon's family, sometimes at the expense of my own independence. We worked on establishing healthier boundaries, a concept that would prove vital in the months ahead. As spring turned to summer, I discovered new interests I'd never had time to explore before. I joined a painting class at the community center, revealing a modest talent for watercolors. I volunteered at the local library, reading to children during Saturday story hour. I even tried yoga, though my arthritic knees protested certain poses. The financial decisions I'd made immediately after the confrontation necessitated some lifestyle adjustments. Without the burden of private school tuition and extracurricular activities for my grandchildren, I was comfortable but needed to be more mindful of expenses. I canceled plans for an extensive kitchen renovation and opted instead for a simpler refresh of my living room, painting the walls myself with Gloria's help. The most significant decision came 3 months after the confrontation. After much consideration and several conversations with my therapist, I decided to sell my condo. It had never truly felt like home, purchased as it was solely to be near Brandon's family. I began looking at smaller places in a 55-plus community about 20 minutes away, close enough to maintain my new friendships and substitute teaching position, but far enough to create a psychological fresh start. 6 months after being told to get out of my son's life, I had built something new and unexpectedly satisfying. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely. I still caught my breath when I saw children who resembled Aiden or Emma, but it no longer defined my days. I had rediscovered the strong, independent woman I'd been before grief and loneliness led me to make my son's family the center of my universe. What I didn't realize was that while I was rebuilding my life piece by piece, my absence was creating unexpected ripple effects in the family that had rejected me. Exactly 1 week after changing my phone number, I opened my rarely used Facebook account to share photos from a community center art show where my watercolor had received an honorable mention. A notification showed I had 99+ unread messages. Curious, I clicked to find my inbox flooded with increasingly desperate notes from Brandon, Stephanie, and even my grandchildren. The earliest messages were formal, almost businesslike. "Mom, I think we need to talk about what happened. Please call me when you get a chance." "Margaret, I may have overreacted the other day. Can we discuss this? As days passed with no response from me, the tone changed dramatically. Mom, please call me. Your phone goes straight to voicemail. Are you okay? Grandma, why aren't you answering your phone? Dad says you're mad at us. Please don't be mad. Margaret, the kids are really upset. Whatever issues we have, please don't punish them. The most recent messages reflected genuine panic. Mom, we've been to your condo 3 times. Neighbors say they've seen you, but you won't answer the door for us. Please let us know you're all right. Grandma, I miss you so much. Please come back. I'm sorry if I did something wrong. I sat staring at my computer screen, emotions warring within me. Part of me felt vindicated. They were finally experiencing the pain of rejection they had so casually inflicted on me. Another part ached at the thought of my grandchildren believing I was angry with them. Later that day, I received an email from Caroline, another teacher I'd stayed in touch with after retirement. She mentioned running into Brandon at the grocery store. He looked terrible, Margaret, she wrote. When I asked about you, he nearly broke down in the produce section. Said there'd been a family disagreement and you'd cut contact. Is everything okay? Through similar coincidental encounters and carefully worded questions to mutual acquaintances, I began piecing together what had happened in my absence. The day after I'd notified the school I would no longer pay tuition, Brandon and Stephanie had been called in for a meeting with the administration. Apparently, they'd been blindsided, having not yet read my email explaining my decision to withdraw financial support. They'd had to scramble to secure emergency loans to keep the children enrolled through the end of the semester. Stephanie's mother, Ruth, now living in Arizona, had flown in to help with childcare since I was no longer available to pick up the kids after school. According to Gloria, who'd overheard a conversation at the community pool, Ruth and Stephanie had gotten into a heated argument after just 3 days. Ruth had returned to Arizona, leaving Brandon and Stephanie to juggle work schedules and childcare on their own. Most surprising was what I learned from Gerald, my attorney, who had run into Brandon at a legal conference. Your son asked me if I'd heard from you, Gerald told me over the phone. When I said I couldn't discuss any client matters, he actually teared up. Said he'd give anything to take back what he'd said to you. These reports created a complex mixture of emotions. The vengeful part of me felt satisfied that they were struggling without my help. The mother in me ached for my son's obvious distress. The grandmother in me worried about how the situation was affecting Aiden and Emma. After nearly 2 months of silence, I received a letter via certified mail. Unlike the emotional Facebook messages, this was thoughtfully composed and deeply reflective. Dear Mom, Brandon wrote, I've written this letter a dozen times, trying to find the right words to express how sorry I am for what happened. There are no right words. What I said was unforgivable. He went on to explain how my absence had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his marriage. Without my financial support and childcare assistance, he and Stephanie had been forced to reevaluate their priorities and spending habits. The strain had led them to couples counseling. The therapist helped us see how we'd been using you as both a crutch and a scapegoat, he wrote. When things were difficult, we relied on your help but resented needing it. Instead of being grateful, we looked for ways you were interfering to justify our resentment. Stephanie had added a handwritten note at the bottom of the letter. Margaret, I was wrong. Completely wrong. My insecurity as a mother made me see your love for my children as criticism of my parenting. I see now how unfair that was. The children miss you terribly. We all do. Enclosed were heartbreaking drawings from Emma and a carefully written letter from Aiden, asking if they could visit, even if Mom and Dad aren't allowed to. I cried for hours after reading their words. The apologies seemed sincere, the regret palpable. But was it enough? Could words erase the memory of being told I had ruined their lives? Could any apology restore the trust that had been so thoroughly broken? I took the letters to my next therapy session, seeking Dr. Levine's perspective. What do you want, Margaret? She asked after reading them. Not what you think you should want, or what would make others happy. What do you want? The question stopped me short. For so long, my wants had been secondary to everyone else's needs. I want to see my grandchildren, I said finally. I miss them so much it physically hurts. But I'm afraid. Afraid of what? afraid of falling back into the same patterns, afraid of being taken for granted, then discarded again when I'm no longer useful. Dr. Levine nodded thoughtfully. Those are valid concerns. What boundaries would need to be in place for you to feel safe reconnecting with your family? That question led to several sessions of intense work, identifying what healthy boundaries would look like, and how I would enforce them if necessary. 3 months after the confrontation, I finally responded to Brandon's letter with one of my own. I accepted his apology but made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time. I suggested meeting at a neutral location, a cafe halfway between our homes, to talk in person. The day of our scheduled meeting, I arrived early, choosing a table with a clear view of the door. My hands trembled slightly as I sipped my tea. When Brandon walked in, I barely recognized him. He had lost weight, and new lines creased his forehead. He spotted me immediately, hesitating before approaching as if unsure of his welcome. "Hi, Mom," he said softly, remaining standing until I gestured to the chair across from me. "Hello, Brandon," I replied, working to keep my voice steady. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult and important of our lives. There were moments of tension, tears on both sides, and painful honesty. Brandon admitted that he and Stephanie had taken my support for granted, while simultaneously resenting their dependence on it. I acknowledged that I had sometimes overstepped boundaries in my eagerness to be needed. "I never meant to make you feel like a failure," I told him, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. "I'm proud of the father you've become." His eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to make you feel unwelcome. I was wrong. So wrong." We agreed to move forward slowly. I would come to dinner the following week. Just dinner, no financial discussions, no childcare arrangements. We would see how it felt and take each step with careful consideration. As we prepared to leave, Brandon asked hesitantly, "The kids really want to see you. Would it be okay if they called you? Just to talk?" I smiled, the first genuine smile I directed at my son in months. "I'd like that very much." Walking back to my car after our meeting, I felt lighter than I had in months. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time I believed healing was possible. Not by returning to our old patterns, but by creating something new and healthier for all of us. 8 months after that devastating confrontation in Brandon's kitchen, I signed the papers on my new home. A charming 2-bedroom villa in a vibrant senior community 15 minutes from my old condo. The distance was symbolic as well as practical. Close enough to maintain regular contact with my family, but far enough to preserve the independence I'd worked so hard to establish. My relationship with Brandon and his family had evolved into something I wouldn't have recognized a year earlier. Gone was the unhealthy dependence, the unspoken expectations, the simmering resentments. In their place was something more balanced, more honest, and ultimately more loving. The boundaries I'd established with Dr. Levine's help had proven crucial to this transformation. I visited Brandon's family once a week for dinner, sometimes twice if there was a special event for the grandchildren. But I no longer appeared unannounced, no longer assumed I was welcome at every family outing, no longer offered unsolicited advice on parenting matters. Financial arrangements had been completely restructured. After much discussion, I agreed to establish education trusts for Aiden and Emma that would help with college expenses when the time came. The money went directly into the trusts, not through Brandon and Stephanie, eliminating the power dynamic that had contributed to our problems. Day-to-day expenses and private school tuition were now entirely their responsibility. "It's actually been good for us," Brandon admitted during one of our honest conversations. "We've had to make some lifestyle adjustments, but we're teaching the kids about budgeting and priorities in a way we never did before." Those adjustments included moving to a smaller house in a less exclusive neighborhood and trading in their luxury vehicles for more practical options. Aiden had transferred to a public magnet school for math and science, where he was thriving among peers who shared his academic interests. Emma remained at her private school but had taken on babysitting jobs to earn money for her art supplies, a responsibility she took surprising pride in. Stephanie and I had reached a tentative peace. Our relationship would never be warm and effusive, but we had developed a mutual respect that seemed more sustainable than the false harmony we'd maintained before. She had returned to therapy on her own, working through issues with her own mother that had colored her perception of my involvement with her children. I confused loving interest with criticism, she told me during a rare moment alone together. I always felt my mother was judging me, so I projected that onto you. It wasn't fair. My relationship with my grandchildren had required the most delicate healing. During those months of separation, they had experienced an adult conflict they couldn't fully understand, with the sudden disappearance of a grandmother who had been a daily presence in their lives. Building back their trust took patience and consistency. Emma, sensitive and expressive, had been the first to fully reconnect. During my initial visit back to their home, she had flung herself into my arms, sobbing against my shoulder. "I thought you stopped loving us," she whispered. "Never," I promised, holding her tight. "I needed some time away from the grown-up problems, but I never stopped loving you. Not for a single minute." Aiden, at 15, had been more reserved, watching carefully from the sidelines before deciding it was safe to let me back into his heart. Our breakthrough came when I attended his regional math competition 3 months after our reconciliation began. Seeing me in the audience supporting him without overstepping seemed to reassure him that things could be different this time. "You know," he said as we walked to the parking lot afterward, "I'm kind of glad we had to figure stuff out without you for a while. Dad says it made us stronger." "Your dad is a wise man," I replied, suppressing the urge to ruffle his hair as I would have done before. At 15, he'd outgrown such gestures. "He said something else too," Aiden continued, studying the ground as we walked. "He said the strongest people are the ones who can admit when they're wrong and try to fix it." He glanced up at me briefly. "I think you're both pretty strong." That moment of connection with my grandson had been worth every painful step of the journey. My life outside the family continued to flourish as well. I maintained my substitute teaching position, typically working 2 or 3 days a week. My watercolor paintings had improved enough that the community center gift shop now sold my hand-painted greeting cards. The book club I joined during those dark early days had become a circle of dear friends who gathered for more than just literary discussion. Gloria remained my closest friend and confidant. She had recently begun dating a gentleman from our community, her first relationship since being widowed 12 years earlier. Watching her navigate the vulnerability of new love in her 70s inspired me to remain open to possibilities I hadn't considered before. 1 year to the day after Brandon had told me to get out, we gathered for a family dinner at my new home. As I looked around my dining table at the faces of those I loved most in the world, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the painful journey that had brought us to this healthier place. After dinner, while the children helped clear the table, Brandon raised his glass in a quiet toast. "To second chances," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "And to the strongest woman I know, my mother." Later, after they had gone and I sat alone on my lanai watching the sunset, I reflected on the lessons of the past year. I had learned that true love sometimes requires walking away. That setting boundaries isn't selfish but necessary. That forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or returning to harmful patterns. Most importantly, I had learned that at 68 years old, I was still capable of growth, change, and self-discovery. The woman I had become through this painful journey was stronger, wiser, and more fulfilled than the woman who had built her entire existence around being needed by others. I had found my voice, my boundaries, and my joy independent of my role as mother and grandmother. That didn't diminish my love for my family. If anything, it had deepened it by making it healthier. As twilight settled over my new community, I picked up my phone and opened my gallery of recent photos. Aiden at his math competition, Emma showing off her latest artwork, Brandon and Stephanie relaxed and smiling at our last family dinner, Gloria and I dressed up for a community theater performance. Each image represented a piece of my life. Not my entire identity, but beautiful, meaningful pieces of a much richer whole. I've shared this story not because it's easy to tell, but because I know others may be struggling with similar family dynamics. If you've ever lost yourself in taking care of others, if you've ever had to walk away from those you love in order to find yourself again, know that you're not alone. The journey is painful but worth every step. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members? How did you maintain your sense of self while supporting those you love? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more reflections on family, growth, and finding strength in life's most challenging moments. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, it's never too late to discover who you truly are.